The Treasury Department moved at 6 a.m. Eastern Time this morning. $40 billion in Iranian assets held in accounts accessible to the United States government and its financial system were frozen. Not sanctioned. Not threatened with sanctions. Not subject to a new regulatory review process with a 30-day comment period. Frozen. Immediately and completely inaccessible to the Iranian government, to the Central Bank of Iran, to any Iranian state entity, and to any private entity acting on behalf of the Iranian government. The legal mechanism used was an executive order invoking emergency economic powers that have been on the books for decades, but that have rarely been deployed at this scale with this speed. The legal authority is not in question. The political implications are very much in question. 6 hours later, Tehran responded. The response was not what most analysts, most governments, and most markets expected. The expectation, based on Iranian rhetoric over the past several weeks, and based on historical patterns of Iranian responses to American economic pressure, was some combination of a threat to close the Strait of Hormuz, an announcement of military exercises designed to signal capability, or an escalatory action by one of Iran's regional proxies, designed to impose costs on American interests without directly engaging American forces. None of those things happened in the first 6 hours. What happened instead was this. Iranian state television broadcast a statement from the Supreme Leader's office that was notably, almost strikingly, calm in its tone and precise in its content. The statement did not threaten immediate military retaliation. It did not announce the closure of the strait. It did not call for emergency military sessions or invoke the language of existential threat that Iranian official communications sometimes employ in moments of genuine crisis. What the statement announced was a 72-hour suspension of all diplomatic contact with any government that supported, endorsed, or participated in the asset freeze, and the immediate recall of Iranian diplomatic personnel from 3 European capitals. The 3 capitals were not named in the initial statement. Subsequent reporting, confirmed by officials in 2 of the affected countries, identified them as Berlin, Paris, and Rome. Read that response carefully, because the restraint embedded in it is itself a message. And understanding what that message is saying and who it is saying it to is the most important analytical task of the next 72 hours. Iran has options that it did not use this morning. Every analyst who covers the region with any seriousness knows what those options are. The Houthi forces in Yemen, who have demonstrated repeatedly the ability to disrupt Red Sea shipping with drone and missile attacks that are increasingly difficult to intercept. The Hezbollah network in Lebanon, whose military capabilities have been rebuilt substantially since 2006, and whose missile inventory is larger and more accurate than it was then. The militia forces in Iraq, who have conducted dozens of attacks on American military positions over the past 18 months, and who have American personnel within effective range. The naval forces Iran maintains in the Gulf, who have conducted harassment operations against commercial shipping. Iran did not activate any of those options in the first 6 hours after a $40 billion asset freeze. That is not an absence of capability. That is a choice. And choices communicate. The first and most immediate question is, what is this restraint communicating, and to whom? The most straightforward reading is that Iran is being strategically cautious because it understands that the United States is operating in a mode where it is looking for a justification to escalate further, and Iran does not want to provide one. The asset freeze is, under this reading, partly a test, a provocation designed to see whether Iran will respond in a way that justifies the next step in an escalating pressure campaign. Choosing not to respond militarily, or through proxy action that could be attributed to Iran, denies the United States the justification it is allegedly seeking, while demonstrating to international audiences that Iran is not the aggressor in this confrontation. This is a sophisticated reading, but it is also a hopeful one. It assumes that Iranian decision-making is calm, unified, and strategically coherent in conditions of extreme economic pressure. Those assumptions are not guaranteed. The Iranian political system is not a simple hierarchy in which one decision-maker issues orders that are executed without friction. There are factions within the Iranian government, within the Revolutionary Guards, within the clerical establishment, that have different views about how to respond to American pressure and different interests in the outcome. The restrained response that appeared on state television this morning may represent the dominant faction's view in this moment. Whether it represents a stable consensus or a temporary balance of forces within a divided leadership is something that outside observers cannot know with certainty. The second reading of the restrained response is more operational and, if accurate, more concerning. The 6-hour response window that produced a diplomatic statement rather than a military action may not have been a period of deliberation. It may have been a period of preparation. Consider what the specific content of the Iranian response actually does when examined closely. The recall of diplomatic personnel from European capitals removes Iranian diplomatic staff from cities where they would be vulnerable, where their communications would be monitored, and where they would be in countries with close intelligence-sharing relationships with the United States. The 72-hour suspension of diplomatic contact creates a defined window of deliberate non-communication through official channels. That suspension is not the same as a suspension of communication through unofficial channels. It is a suspension of official diplomatic contact. The unofficial channels remain open. What happens in the official communications blackout, away from the formal diplomatic channels that are now suspended, is a question that intelligence services in Washington, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and London are working on right now with considerable urgency. American intelligence agencies have been watching the pattern of communications between Tehran and its regional partners very carefully. Reports from sources with knowledge of what intelligence agencies have been collecting, reported by news organizations with established records on this beat, describe a significant increase in encrypted communications between Iranian command structures and affiliated forces in Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon in the 6-hour window between the asset freeze and the official Iranian response. These are not low-level operational communications. They are being described as command-level communications. The content of those communications is not publicly available and may not be available to anyone outside a very small number of people in the intelligence community. But the volume and the level of the communications is itself information that is being taken seriously. This does not mean Iran is preparing an imminent military action. Intelligence assessments are probabilities, not certainties. And the history of intelligence analysis of Iranian intentions is full of moments where the pattern of communications suggested one thing and the actual Iranian behavior was different. But it is not nothing. And the people responsible for the safety of American military personnel in the region, for the security of American allies and partners, and for the integrity of critical infrastructure that could be targeted in an escalatory scenario, are not treating it as nothing. The oil market has made its own assessment of what the Iranian response means. Brent crude, the international benchmark, moved sharply upward within the first hour of the Iranian statement being broadcast. The movement was not as dramatic as it would have been if Iran had announced the closure of the strait or a direct military action. But it was significant. What the market is pricing is not the certainty of disruption. It is a recalibrated probability distribution. A higher chance that something will happen that disrupts supply. The specific something does not need to be identified. The market just needs to believe it is more likely than it was 6 hours ago. That belief is already in the price. The diplomatic situation has also shifted in ways that are less dramatic but potentially more consequential than the market move. 3 members of the United Nations Security Council have requested an emergency session to discuss the situation. The specific request, submitted through the procedural channels that govern such requests, is asking for the Security Council to convene within 24 hours. The United States has not yet formally responded to the request. Procedurally, the United States can block an emergency session through several mechanisms. Whether it chooses to do so is a decision that is expected within the next few hours. That decision is more significant than it might appear. If the United States allows the Security Council session to proceed, it is creating space, deliberately or not, for a multilateral diplomatic track to develop alongside the bilateral pressure campaign. Other Council members, particularly China and Russia, would use that session to advance positions and proposals that could constrain American options or reframe the crisis in ways that are uncomfortable for Washington. But the session would also give Iran a diplomatic stage that might actually serve Iranian interests more than American ones. So allowing the session involves accepting those costs. If the United States blocks the session, it is signaling that it does not believe multilateral diplomacy is the path it wants to pursue right now. That signal has its own costs. It will be characterized by critics, including many governments that are not adversaries of the United States, as evidence that Washington is not genuinely interested in a diplomatic resolution. That characterization, even if disputed, shapes the political environment in which any subsequent American actions are evaluated. Neither option is clean. Both involve trade-offs. The decision will be made by people who are simultaneously managing a dozen other dimensions of this crisis, under time pressure, with incomplete information about what Iran is actually planning and what the next 72 hours will bring. The 72 hours that Iran's diplomatic suspension defines is also, somewhat ironically, a window that could work in the direction of de-escalation rather than escalation. The Omani Channel, which has historically functioned as the most reliable back-channel between Tehran and Washington, is not subject to the Iranian diplomatic suspension because it operates outside formal diplomatic structures. Sources with knowledge of the channel confirm that it has been active. The content of what is being communicated through it is not publicly available, but the fact that it is active during a period when official channels are suspended is itself significant. It means that whoever is making decisions in Tehran has left open a mechanism for informal communication while closing the formal ones. That is a choice. It may be the most important choice Iran has made in the past 6 hours. Whether the informal channel can produce something in 72 hours that the formal process could not produce in weeks is the question that the next 3 days will answer. The people working that channel are working under conditions that are genuinely difficult to describe from the outside. They are trying to find a formulation, a sequence of events, a set of parallel actions that allows both governments to step back from a confrontation that neither has yet fully committed to, while allowing both to characterize the result in ways that are politically survivable at home. The American side needs to be able to say that Iran blinked. The Iranian side needs to be able to say that the pressure did not work. Both of those things cannot be literally true simultaneously, but both of them can be made to appear true simultaneously if the diplomatic packaging is skillful enough. That is what is being attempted right now in the conversations that none of us are part of. The assets are frozen. The clock is running on multiple timelines simultaneously. The official channels are suspended, and the unofficial ones are active. The markets have moved and are watching. The military assets are positioned and ready. The intelligence picture is concerning but not definitive. And the 72-hour window that Iran created, whether deliberately as a negotiating frame or as a genuine suspension of contact, is the space in which this either resolves or it doesn't. We are watching everything as it develops. The situation is moving. The next development could come from Tehran, or from Washington, or from one of the back channels, or from an action somewhere in the region that neither capital planned or authorized. All of those possibilities are live right now. What we know is that the next 72 hours matter more than the past several weeks. The decisions being made now, in the rooms we cannot see, by the people whose names we may not know until this is over, are the decisions that determine whether this is a crisis that was managed or a turning point that was not. We will be here for all of it. The history of economic sanctions as a tool of American foreign policy provides important context for understanding what is happening right now and what is likely to happen next. Sanctions have been used by the United States against Iran in various forms for more than 4 decades, since the hostage crisis of 1979 and 1980. The sanctions regime has been expanded, tightened, partially relaxed, and then expanded again through multiple administrations of both parties. The $40 billion asset freeze announced this morning is not the first significant escalation in that regime. It is the latest in a long sequence. What the history of Iran sanctions tells us is that economic pressure on Iran has had a complicated and often non-linear relationship with Iranian behavior. There are moments when economic pressure produced negotiations and agreements. The period leading up to the 2015 nuclear deal is the clearest example. The sanctions regime that was in place in the years before that agreement was causing real economic pain in Iran, and that pain was part of what created the political conditions for Iranian decision-makers to authorize the negotiations that eventually produced the deal. So the argument that economic pressure can produce Iranian behavioral change is not without foundation. But the history also tells us that economic pressure can produce Iranian behavior that is the opposite of what was intended. When pressure is applied in ways that leave no face-saving exit for Iranian leadership, or that are perceived domestically within Iran as part of a campaign of regime change rather than a campaign to change specific policies, the Iranian response has historically been to harden its position rather than to soften it. The political dynamics inside Iran around American pressure are complicated. The Iranian government can, in certain circumstances, use American pressure as a domestic political resource, framing resistance to that pressure as national dignity and sovereignty. Understanding when Iranian leadership can use pressure that way, and when they cannot, is the most important analytical challenge in assessing what the current sanctions action will produce. The $40 billion number is significant in ways that go beyond its absolute size. The specific assets being frozen include funds that the Iranian government has been expecting to access for specific domestic programs. The freezing of those assets is not just an abstract economic cost. It directly prevents specific planned actions. It creates specific problems for specific institutions and programs within Iran. The targeted nature of the freeze, beyond its aggregate size, is designed to maximize the political pressure on the decision-makers who control the specific programs being affected. Whether that design is effective depends on whether the Iranian decision-makers who feel the most specific pain from this action are the same people who have the authority and the political will to change the course of action that produced the freeze. In political systems as complex as Iran's, where authority is distributed across multiple institutions, the presidency, the Supreme Leader's office, the Revolutionary Guards, the clerical establishment, the assumption that economic pain flows directly to political decision in a predictable way is not always valid. The people who feel the most pain may not be the people who make the relevant decisions. The people who make the relevant decisions may be insulated from the pain in ways that the designers of the pressure campaign did not fully anticipate. This is not an argument against sanctions as a tool. It is an argument for realistic expectations about what they can accomplish, and in what time frame. The current pressure campaign, the $40 billion freeze specifically, is designed to create urgency, to force a decision in a compressed time frame, to make the cost of continued confrontation so immediate and so visible that Iranian decision-makers conclude that changing course is less costly than continuing. Whether that logic is correct for this specific action, at this specific moment, with these specific decision-makers, is the question that the next 72 hours will begin to answer. The congressional reaction in the United States is also worth tracking because it shapes the options available to the administration in the coming days. The asset freeze was executed through executive authority without congressional authorization or notification in advance. Some members of Congress have raised procedural objections. Some have praised the action as long overdue. The political environment in Washington creates a different kind of pressure on the administration than the diplomatic environment in Muscat and Doha. Domestic political pressure to show strength interacts with diplomatic back-channel processes that require restraint and flexibility in ways that are not always compatible. The administration is simultaneously managing a pressure campaign against Iran, a diplomatic back-channel that requires signaling willingness to de-escalate, an alliance structure that is visibly fracturing on this question, a Congress that has its own views and its own institutional interests, and a domestic political environment where perceptions of strength and weakness have immediate consequences. Managing all of those simultaneously, under the time pressure of a 72-hour Iranian diplomatic suspension and the ongoing market reaction to the asset freeze, requires a kind of coordination across multiple dimensions of government that is genuinely difficult to sustain. The people watching most closely for signs of that coordination succeeding or failing are the Iranian decision-makers trying to assess whether the American position is as firm and coherent as it appears publicly, or whether there are internal tensions within the American government that create exploitable gaps. Every public statement, every congressional reaction, every market movement, every allied government's position or non-position is information that Iranian analysts are processing in real time to build their assessment of American resolve and American unity. That assessment, more than anything else, shapes what Iran does next, and what Iran does next shapes everything that follows. The 72-hour window is running, the assets are frozen, the markets are watching, the back channels are active. The public positions on both sides are hardening in public, while somewhere in private, the conversations that actually determine the outcome are happening. We will continue to report on everything that is visible, and to be clear about the line between what we know and what we cannot yet know. The situation is not resolved. It is moving. And the direction it is moving in the next few hours matters more than anything that has happened in the past few days. Stay with us.